Hello, fictional. Welcome to the What If Issei. Today we are gonna see what if Issei's memory shattered at dawn. Part 1. If you end up liking this video, please consider subscribe, so without further ado, let's get into the video. Behind his eyes, sparks danced. And on his skin, warmth crawled. He wasn't sure why, at first. What was this haze, this aura, in his eyelids? It shifted, churned with sparks. 1 second, it seemed red, then orange, then blue, then other colors, all without quite seeming to actually be those colors at all. The sparks, colored and yet not, twisted and bent about the way the wax in a lava lamp separates and rejoins like sludge, all without rhythm or rhyme. Shapes appeared and disappeared, gained coherence and lost it just as quickly in the way of someone halfway between consciousness and drowsiness. The warmth, too, was confusing. It slid all over his skin, enveloped him in a way he absolutely detested. Had he just turned the heat up and forgotten? Or perhaps left the curtains open or something else? And more to the point, what the hell had happened to the bed? He felt neither sheets nor duvet over his skin. But the lack of cloth atop him wasn't all that was wrong, the mattress seemed to have lost all of its padding, and his pillow was nowhere to be found, either. His neck was stiff, and part of his skull was sore from resting directly against a surface. Then his arms shifted, and he felt something else. Dirt. Not much of it, but dirt. And what lightly scraped his arm from beneath at his motions was the rough touch of stone. Issei Hyoudu's eyes finally dragged open, and he saw the reasons for all of these things. What the hell? Issei murmured, barely aware that he'd spoken at all. He wasn't in bed. That wasn't much of a surprise, really. Nor was his knowledge of where he was, either just a secluded plaza in the local park that Issei often used as a shortcut on his way back from the mall. No, the real surprise was his being here at all. How the hell had he fallen asleep out here? Issei slowly pushed himself to stand on stiff legs, head throbbing and throat parched. But neither of those things were what he was paying attention to. He squinted hard against the sun, wondering when the hell it had gotten so bright. Issei was a teenager and spent a lot of his time in darkened rooms, that much was true, but he didn't hate the sun. Or, at the very least, he hadn't. Now that opinion was being reconsidered. The warm rays of light seemed hateful, now, cruel and mocking. No longer did they welcome him out into the day, now, they seemed want nothing but to drive him into the dark and keep him there. Even as he stood there, Issei's eyes began to water, but as he took a slow breath, he noticed something else he didn't remember. The lightly bittersweet scent of the cherry blossom trees around him was now almost noxious and choking. Beneath it, there was the unmistakable earthy scent of the dirt they grew in, and mixed into it was the scent of water. Issei's head turned, and as it did, he saw the fountain sitting directly in the center of the secluded plaza. He stared at it for a long while, at its plain-looking spigot that extended several meters into the air. At the water that flowed from the spigot's top and into the basin below. Issei stared into the source of the scent, lost in both confusion and wonder. Confusion at his own ability to smell the things he did, wonder at how he had missed it before. That his unplanned night out in the park somehow cleared out a sinus problem he somehow hadn't known about. Issei shook his head even as the thought crossed his mind. But if not that, then what? Issei's mind was drawing a blank, and he gave his head another shake. It was what it was. Issei didn't know the why, and that question certainly left him quite interested, but he tried to shove it to the back of his mind. The answer wasn't going to just appear conveniently in his brain, after all. As he turned his back to the sun and his head down to the shadow he cast, his brow furrowed as he tried to piece together a more basic question. What the hell was he doing out here? Issei's fingers slowly and unconsciously reached up to dig into the side of his skull. And the harder he thought about things, the deeper his fingernails dug. He remembered getting up to his alarm. Going to school. Playing video games and watching porn at Mitsuda's house after classes let out for the day. Returning home, eating dinner with his family, doing homework and then going to bed. At no point in between then and now had he come anywhere near this park. Issei shivered despite, or perhaps, in some strange way, because of the sun's glaring down on him. At its insistence that he leave its rays and cease insulting it by its presence. His fingers dropped from the side of his head, falling by their own will and digging through his pocket. They searched for a single heart-racking instant before finding what they sought and pulling it out. And as Issei opened his phone, he gave a hard swallow, saliva trickling down a throat that screamed for hydration. It was 7:45 on a Sunday morning. But when Issei had gone to sleep, it had been just past 10 on a Friday night. Issei took one slow breath after another as he walked, trying to keep his heart rate from going to madness, even as it threatened to leap out of his chest. He was having little success with that, and the constant breaths of the trees and earth wasn't helping. After seeing the day in his phone, Issei had immediately decided to go home. He didn't have much of a plan beyond that, but to have a plan to that point was comforting. And as he almost always did when coming this direction, he'd taken the shortcut. It cut off about half a kilometer from the walk back, and well, perhaps not all that much, all things considered. Anything that would shorten the distance between him and his house would be much appreciated right about now. The once pleasant smell of the woodland patch was now inviting in the first twinges of a headache. The woody scent mixed with the earths was a pungent concoction now, and Issei desperately hoped this enhanced sense of smell would go away sooner than later. That hope was increased further as he reached the small fence one had to leap to get back to the sidewalk. Even as Issei approached, the combined smell of gasoline, diesel, stone and slightly warm tar nearly made him retch. As he walked, he silently wondered to himself if Kuo had always smelled this bad and he just hadn't noticed. But as he approached an intersection he needed to cross and checked both ways, his thoughts about the smell of the tarmac, the continued wrath of the sun's rays and the parchedness in his throat were all shoved to the back of his mind by the hum of a motor. On instinct, Issei looked both ways, trying to discern the direction the car was coming from. But he saw absolutely nothing there, even as the grinding sound of the car's engine grew louder and louder. Issei spun around, looking at the sleepy, empty street in front of and behind him, but still no car appeared to claim ownership of the growling engine that grew still louder in Issei's ears. Issei's teeth ground in his gums. That engine, wherever it was, wasn't getting any quieter, and the headache Issei had been getting from the smell of the tarmac, trash cans and other assorted nastiness proved to be bolstered just as much by its roar. Then, after nearly 30 seconds of looking around, a perfectly normal sedan rounded the corner to Issei's right. And as it did so, the roar of the engine suddenly became much louder than it already was. Vaguely, Issei realized that the hum of the engine's pistons and cranks and whatever else wasn't all that was there. Beneath the roar of the engine, he could hear the grinding rumble of the tires as they spun beneath the metal frame, the spitting choke of the exhaust as it pumped foul-smelling fumes into the air. All of the sounds of the vehicle coalesced together, and the resulting low-pitched screech grew ever louder as the car drove closer to Issei. Intolerably louder, as it turned out. As the car drove through the intersection, Issei found himself with his hands involuntarily clamped over his ears like a small child. Then, as it passed him, the sound of it began to finally and mercifully quiet down, and after almost a minute, Issei could finally hear clearly again. And when he could, Issei became aware of something else, something so obvious that he was rather shocked he hadn't noticed it prior. It wasn't just that the sun was more hateful or that Kuo smelled much worse. The entire world had suddenly become louder. It was as though a particularly petty and vindictive god had gone to some mystical dial and turned all the sounds of the world up by several notches on the speakers. Even as he crossed the street, Issei could hear the lousy-smelling wind blow in a gentle gust that sounded like a full-force gale. The few people he saw as he walked back seemed to be stamping their feet with every step, and every time a car passed him, Issei just about wanted to slice his own ears off. All the while, the infuriated rays of the sun incessantly cut at his skin, and the parchedness of his throat only grew more aggravating. With his senses kicked well past overdrive and the sun itself having decided that it wanted him dead, the normally 20-minute walk from Issei's house to the mall took more than twice that long. Eventually, however, Issei did manage to drag himself back to his house. He'd hoped to slip inside unnoticed, pretend that he'd just come back late. His mother, naturally, was standing directly inside the front door. "Issei Hyoudou," she snapped, in the way parents do to get their child's attention. As parents also do, she didn't let him get a single word of explanation before immediately plowing ahead. "Where were you last night? Your father and I were worried sick. And don't tell me you were at a friend's house. We called both of your friends and neither of them had seen you. Your father's out driving all over town looking for you and..." Issei was nodding along with his mother's worried ranting, but he was already starting to check out mentally. As he did, he noticed something else, something perhaps odder than every single thing he'd experienced since waking up an hour or so ago. His mother smelled good. Better than good. Quite delectable, in fact, but not in the way one would expect. She didn't smell good because she and her clothes were well cleaned and because of perfume. Certainly, Issei's nose made it clear to him that both of those things were true, but that wasn't the smell Issei's mind was so fond of. If anything, that was actually rather annoying. While it wasn't near as strong as the tarmac and trash of outside, the close quarters meant the comparatively weak scents of soap and perfume were still too powerful for Issei's liking. No, the lovely smell was of something else. A wonderful, salty smell, like a breeze of the ocean, yet with a metallic tang mixed in. Only when he noticed she had stopped rambling after several minutes did Issei come back to reality. "Well?" she demanded, brown eyes that her son had inherited leaving Issei feeling as though he were being scanned by an electron microscope. As mothers' eyes do. Issei said, fidgeting slightly. "I fell asleep in the park." His mother's eyes narrowed. "You fell asleep? In the park?" Issei nodded, eyes darting from side to side. "And you really expect me to believe that?" Issei remained silent at the question that was already answered by his mother's tone. Fine, his mother said, glaring at him harsher than the sun had been. Lie to me. But I will find out, Issei, and when I do, you're going to wish you just told me the truth. Your father will hear about this, too, once he gets home. Issei nodded in that submissive way expected of a child being scolded by an angry parent. But as she walked away, a rather dry thought wormed its way into his head. Be sure you tell me as soon as you figure it out. I'd love to know, too. Once his mother had gotten out of his face and stomped off upstairs, Issei walked to the kitchen. Now that he was out of the sun's rays and in the security of his own home, Issei sought to do something about that dry throat. For just a moment, he fished around in the cabinet before snatching a glass. Then, he went to the tap and watched the water flow. Issei's stomach churned as he stared down into the partially full cup. 6 damn cups of water he'd drunk now, and they weren't small cups. And yet his throat still felt dry as ever, maybe even worse. But Issei stubbornly fought off the queasiness in his gut and turned up a glass, trying to force yet more water into his system. As he downed the last of the water, Issei made a split-second decision that it would be his last glass for a while. His stomach kept rocking about, its own little storm threatening to billow into a rather foul tsunami if jostled too much. Slowly, steadily, he walked out of the kitchen, back into the front room and towards the stairs. Just in time to nearly crash into his father. Issei. His father yelped, but the cry didn't have much alarm. You're okay? Yeah, Issei said. Before he could continue, however, his father kept speaking. I guess your mother already screamed at you? Issei nodded and his father returned the gesture, his expression sympathetic. Moms are like that. Mine did the same to me when I stayed out the first time. He winked. No need to tell me what you were doing. I know the sorts of things guys your age get up to when we're not around. Issei swallowed and said nothing, but to his relief, his father didn't seem to notice as he treaded up the same stairs his mother had gone. Once Issei heard his parents' door open and close, he followed his father's track. As he walked up the stairs, Issei's plan was to go to his room, draw the curtains back, turn all the lights off and lie down for a while. Then his stomach gave a particularly nasty shake and Issei was left going straight towards the bathroom. The churning grew worse with every step and second, and even as Issei threw the door open, it felt as though his stomach would start erupting. Just as it reached a fever pitch, Issei leaned down over the toilet, sure that every single drop of water he'd just drunk was going to come right back out, along with whatever else might be in there. Nothing came up. At the last possible instant, his stomach and the storm going on inside it subsided. For a while, Issei stayed knelt there. Not moving, sure that his stomach was working against him to fake him out and erupt when he was far from somewhere that the result could be easily disposed of. But as the time passed, Issei's fright over that began to wane. There were no signs of the nausea returning, no hint that everything in his stomach. Even as he stood once the while was up, Issei began to feel just a little better, even if the dryness in his throat and inexplicable, unquenchable thirst refused to abate. He turned. And froze when he looked in the mirror. Issei couldn't figure out quite why at first. The young man in the mirror seemed to be the same person who'd greeted him so many times before. He had Issei's same face, the same perverted grin and the same clothes he was used to wearing. As his eyes kept looking over the young man in the mirror, the young man in the glasses' eyes matching his every movement in perfect reverse, Issei noticed something. Was he going crazy, or was he paler than he was before? Issei blinked as his left hand ran down his right arm and his mirror twin's right ran down his left. He stared as the skin blanched and then returned some of its color, but it didn't help him make any judgment. Issei had never been the darkest-skinned individual, and if he had grown paler, he couldn't quite tell. Issei shook his head, his mind idly rambling to itself that he just might be going a little bit crazy. The teen started to turn from the mirror and then froze once more when the sensation hit him again. That sensation that there was something wrong with the young man in the mirror. He turned back again and looked at himself once more. He went somewhat more in depth this time, looking over every exposed bit of skin that he could. But that turned up just as inconclusive as before. Issei leaned toward the mirror a bit more and for just a moment, his eyes and the eyes of the young man in the mirror crossed. And then he saw it. And when he did, both Issei's eyes and the eyes of the one in the mirror widened in perfect unison. When Issei had gone to sleep at 10 o'clock on Friday evening, his eyes had been the same earthy brown that his mother had. The young man who stared back at him had eyes that almost glowed a rich ruby red. And as his and the young man in the mirror's jaws fell open, each caught sight of the extended canines in the other's mouth. Fangs. Issei Hyoudou had fangs. They weren't as impressive as the word might make them sound. They weren't more than perhaps 1.5 centimeters longer than either teen's original canines might have been. 2 at most. They fit comfortably in his mouth and in fact didn't even pick at the insides of his gums within his closed jaw. But they were still much larger than the canines he'd had just 2 days before, and that was enough. They didn't need to extend to the lengths of the saber-toothed cats to make their mark, to seize him and terrify him in one sweeping gesture. The real Issei and the one in the glass were captivated by those bits of sharpened enamel, both for their shape and their implications. They stared at one another, each partly fascinated, partly terrified by what they saw. Thoughts ran wild in their heads, jumping from point to point, and slowly, ever so slowly, the puzzle pieces began to come together. The sun. The sounds, the smells. The thirst. And now. Only when a new sound came in did Issei Hyoudou snap back to reality, and the puzzle pieces fell back down, not fully assembled. The new sound was a simple knock on the door of the bathroom. A second or two later, it was joined by more of them, and then by the voice of Issei's father. "Issei? Are you almost done in there?" Yeah," Issei said, voice trembling slightly as his heart thudded, and he struggled to keep his breathing in check. I'm just washing my hands." For auditory proof of that, Issei flicked the tap handle. His father gave an appreciative grunt at the sound of running water. A moment or so later, Issei's suddenly enhanced hearing told the teen that Mr. Hyoudou was trudging back down the hall. But even as Issei gave his hands a quick rinsing, he did so thoughtlessly. Cleanliness and hygiene were the farthest thing from his mind. As he cleared out of the bathroom, his thoughts began to bounce off of one another once more as he tried once more to recall the previous night. Issei's teeth ground as he, again, drew a complete blank. Not one image or fragment of the previous evening would shine itself under the light. Not that Issei could really blame it, of course. After his little walk home, Issei himself had no desire to expose himself to the rays of the sun, either. As he dried his hands off, he turned and looked in the mirror once last time, at the young man who stared back at him. The same crimson eyes gave him back his worried stare. Issei left the bathroom with a head full of fuzz. Nothing about any of this made sense. Not his senses or his appearance. The answer that jumped into his mind as those jigsaw pieces had come together was nonsensical, because they didn't exist. But when he tried to come up with another explanation, Issei drew the same blank he'd drawn before. Nothing else would explain his sense, the eyes or the fangs. Nothing that he could think of, anyway. Those thoughts chased each other for the entire 22 steps between the bathroom on the hallway and Issei's bedroom, and up to Issei's opening the door. Issei knew that his room probably wasn't the best smelling place in the house, but now he found out just how true that actually was. The stench that wafted from Issei's personal air was nothing short of stupendous. The reek of sweat mixed with the vile fragrance of general body odor, and the stench of what was no doubt traces of another, altogether less appropriate to discuss liquid, slammed into Issei's nose with such force that he almost doubled over from retching. Luckily for him, the choppy waters of his queasy stomach remained calm enough that he was able to keep things under control on that front. He didn't need to add the smell of his own vomit to this foul concoction. After a few moments, Issei turned and staggered back down the hallway, a decision having been made nearly the instant he'd breathed the air in the room. About halfway between his room and the bathroom, he turned and opened up the closet. From it, he extracted a number of bottles of cleaning chemicals, paper towels, a vacuum cleaner, the rug scrubber, garbage bags and several other implements. Then, he turned again. Walked back down the hall. Took a breath of fresh air. And stepped inside to begin the war on stench. He started first with the most obvious thing, the dirty clothes. Those were tossed in the washing machine with enough detergent and fabric softener to make a dirty rag sitting in pond scum for a year smell like a spring breeze. Next came the bed sheets. Those were stripped from the mattress almost as soon as Issei returned from the washing machine. He stacked those on top of said machine, as much trying to get any source of smell whatsoever out of the room as set them up for later. After that, Issei began to rifle through what was on his desk. Every single broken pencil, wadded up piece of paper, tiny crumbs of food and anything else he hadn't previously bothered to clean out, all of it went in the trash. Whatever remained was thoroughly wiped down with rags sprayed with dusting chemicals. His closet came next. Issei tore everything out of it, throwing away a good chunk of what was in it in the process. Most of it was junk he hadn't used in years and wouldn't miss, anyway. What was left, and it wasn't much, was pulled out. From there, every item was cleaned, disinfected, and otherwise washed. The racks and inside walls of the closet received the same treatment. Issei made sure to slide the box of particularly delightful porn out of sight of a cursory glance. Once he was done with that, he went back to the washing machine, transferring his clothes to the dryer and sheets to the washer. As soon as he finished up in there, Issei went to the window and scrubbed both the glass and the sill until each was smooth and silk. Luckily for Issei, the sun only directly faced his window in the early morning. His door, desk chair, bed frame and every other bit of furniture in the room received the same treatment. Even his alarm clock was thoroughly wiped down. From there, Issei gave the walls a scrubbing, cleaning off a few minor stains and leaving them appearing almost freshly painted. He returned for a third time to the dryer after that, tossing his sheets and duvet in to be stripped of their moisture after extracting his clothes. After getting down on his hands and knees to scrub every single baseboard in the room until they nearly shined, Issei turned to the last two tools he'd brought along with him. Issei had intended to vacuum the entire room. To clean every single corner of every inch of dirt that might still remain. He couldn't imagine that there would be much, considering the more than a trash bag's worth of filthy towels he'd thrown away at this point. All the same, he wanted every single ounce he could remove gone. Even though his nose had grown used to the foul smell in a few minutes and was more concerned with the powerful cleaning chemicals he was using, Issei wanted to make sure that his room didn't stay awful smelling. Alas, he'd failed to consider one minor aspect of most vacuum cleaners that would be of great interest to another sense that had been enhanced recently. As soon as he turned the vacuum on, Issei's ears were immediately assaulted by a screaming whine that left him desperately turning it back off just to give mercy to his ears. He tried again, and he still couldn't bear it. A third time yielded the same result, and at that point, Issei went digging through his desk. For a few moments, he thought he'd thrown them away. Then, he spied the pair of earplugs, still unopened, that he'd won in some game years ago and haphazardly thrown into the bowels of one of his drawers to go unused. With relish, he ripped the plastic and cardboard apart and stuffed the cylindrical bits of foam into his ears. The vacuum was still hard on his ears with the earplugs in, but much less so. Not so much that Issei couldn't use it, he did. Every single square centimeter of carpet that it could reach was subjected to its rolling, sucking attention. The hoses on the same, with all their little attachments, searched every crevice and corner they could possibly reach. But just left one final place that it could reach quite so easily. Issei had pulled aside his bed a few times before, of course, usually to look for a magazine or visual novel that he had borrowed from Mitsuda or Motohama. It was usually an intensive effort, one that left him with sweat trickling down his brow. So as one might expect, Issei was immensely surprised when his bed moved with what was, from his perspective, a light tug. Not just move, it practically glided across the floor when he put any strain into his muscles. And for just a moment, Issei remembered the red eyes of the young man in the mirror. Without any prompting, his tongue instinctively flicked around the inside of his mouth. He could still feel them. The fangs. Issei gave a vigorous shake of his head, desperately trying to toss the images out of his mind, as though they might conveniently slide out through his ears. As he sorted through what little was under the bed, he kept doing that. Perhaps a little too quickly, he finished. The screeching of the vacuum helped to drown his thoughts. The scrubbing of the carpet followed on from there, with Issei moving the bed back into place, with the same curious ease with which he'd initially dislodged it. The quick trip back to the dryer left him with his bed sheets, which Issei spread across the mattress. It was just as he was smearing out a few creases in the duvet that a knock at the door made him jump. His head snapped around to see his father. "A little jumpy, are we?" he asked, a slight grin on his face. "Sorry," Issei mumbled. I was just finishing up." "Good timing," his father replied. "Your mother sent me up to let you know that dinner's ready." "Already? Isn't it a little?" The rest of that sentence died in Issei's throat as he looked over at his alarm clock. It was 6:15, and through the window Issei could see that the sky had turned dark blue and purple as the sun slipped down. He'd been at the cleaning process for nearly 7 hours. "Oh, thanks," Issei said. His father's head snapped around, taking a quick look around with a hint of the smile from before still tugging on his lips. "Looks good, Issei. Nice job." "Thanks." Issei gave a smile at that, but just before his lips could part, Issei's better judgment forced them to remain closed. It was quite obvious throughout dinner that his mother was still angry at him for having vanished overnight. Every word she spoke was intensely terse, filled with the sort of quiet hostility that a parent uses to make clear that they haven't forgotten their child's latest screw-up just yet. Issei's father tried to get a conversation going, but nothing stuck. Issei didn't want to open his mouth more than he had to, and looking either his mother or father in the eye was straight out. One ill-timed gaze, one particularly attentive moment on either of their parts, and he knew he'd be up to his elbows in trouble. Because there was no explanation for what was in his mouth. There was no explanation for his eyes. And there was no explanation for something else, something that wasn't visible from the outside. The dryness in his throat. Issei's marathon deep clean of his entire room had started off as a way to expunge the odors that came with a teenage boy's living in it and not always being the cleanest of people. But it had had another effect, this one altogether unintentional. It had kept his mind busy. His focus had been entirely on scrubbing every bit of dirt and filth out of his room, not on his memory and the changes to his physical appearance. But that out of the way, there was nothing else to distract him from the young man in the mirror. Because, he supposed, his thoughts were wrong. Sitting at that table, his mind started working on the jigsaw puzzle again, and there weren't many pieces left. There was an explanation, and the more Issei thought about it, the more likely it seemed. Issei also had no doubt that if he told anyone about it, he'd be tossed into a mental hospital. Without much conversation, dinner flowed by. When it finished, Issei thanked his mother for the food, as expected. Also as expected, he asked if she needed help with the dishes and, yet again, as expected, she told him she didn't. They went through that routine every day. He had been asking every night they'd had dinner together since he was 12 if she needed help. Never did she need it, but never did she grow annoyed with his offers. After being excused from the table, Issei walked back up the stairs to his own bedroom. To his relief, the air was at least moderately breathable now. Issei had had some plans made when he walked up the stairs. He'd intended to study for an exam he had coming up, then maybe watch porn. As soon as he saw the bed, however, all of those plans collapsed as Issei felt an unnatural exhaustion surge. It washed through him like a tsunami, crashing through every bit of discipline and logic that told him to stay awake longer. Within just a few minutes, Issei was asleep beneath freshly washed sheets. A single, loud tap jolted Issei awake. For a few moments after, he didn't remember much of anything about the previous day. And when he did recall those things, he thought, for just a few moments, that they themselves had been a dream. But then he swallowed, and he felt the dryness in his throat. Felt that unquenchable thirst that seemed to get worse every time he paid attention to it. A slight flick of the tongue, and he felt the fangs. He sat up, heart beginning to throb again as he thought it over once more. He barely noticed that it was 4:15 in the morning, and that he ought to be trying to get back to sleep. It was a minor movement that caught his eye, one very slight twitch of something in the room. It was practically coincidence that he'd seen it at all, that little shadow on the floor. But he did see it and stared at the rectangle on the floor. It fluttered this way and that, twitching as though blown about by a gust of wind. It took a few seconds for Issei to realize that the rectangle sat directly in the center of a patch of silvery light. The light from his window. Issei looked up and he saw it. Saw the tiny piece of paper taped to his window. In an instant, he'd thrown the covers off of himself. A few seconds after, he was at the window, unlocking it and reaching out to snatch the piece of paper from the exterior glass. And in the square of moonlight, he read the text on the paper. Do not resist the craving, or it will drive you mad. Lady Morgan. Standing there in that patch of moonlight, Issei stared down at the note in his hand, all exhaustion forgotten. Do not resist the craving, or it will drive you mad. Issei read that sentence over and over and over again. Who might have written it and signed their name to it was forgotten for those minutes as he mutely processed the note in a rapid, seemingly unending loop. But for all the times Issei read the note, in reality, he only truly read it once. His eyes darted back and forth, yes, but the motion wasn't driven by any conscious thought. No rationality or reason or thought went into just moving that pair of organs set into his head, and given that case, how surprising is it that his rational mind wasn't bothering to acknowledge what the eyes were sending it. Do not resist the craving, or it will drive you mad. Issei supposed that that sentence should have scared him both for its explicit meaning and the implication the very existence of the paper it was written on carried. Yet there wasn't any fear. Only a cold, whispered, dead feeling, no different than the feeling that the bone-chilling winds of winter leave on skin left exposed too long. It was only the briefest moment of lucidity that brought the fact that he'd dropped the note to the floor to his conscious attention. After a moment, he caught sight of it a meter or so away. The paper, as paper is wont to do, caught the air like a kite and sailed just the slightest step from where it had dropped from. Issei made no move to pick it up. His eyes had no desire whatsoever to slide over the ink on the page for the 100th time, and his conscious mind had no will to force his body to pick the note up. In fact, after a minute or so, Issei joined the paper on the scrubbed carpet floor. As he sat there, still in that patch of brilliant silver light, the words played over and over again in his mind. Do not resist the craving, or it will drive you mad. In the first fractions of a moment after reading it, Issei hadn't known what to make of what the note said. But as the seconds ticked by, the pieces of the mental jigsaw puzzle he'd started the previous day fell into place in his mind. And now he knew. Or at least he thought he did. But perhaps that was wrong, too. All things considered, was Issei truly surprised by the picture that mental jigsaw puzzle formed? Hadn't he known already, regardless of whether or not he'd been able to bring himself to believe it? Even as the questions came to his mind, Issei knew the answer to each one. Seated there on the carpet and in the moon, Issei's mind darted back over the previous day. He remembered the smells and sounds of the outside world and the sun's wrath on his skin. Issei supposed that he'd known something was wrong even then. He remembered the lovely smell rolling off of his mother, that fresh salt and iron scent. Even as he looked back at it, Issei knew that he'd just been denying the obvious. He'd known what he was smelling. He'd known that he wanted to consume it. Feel it roll across his tongue and down his throat. His unconscious mind might not have let him comprehend it before now, but it had been there, burrowing underneath his conscious thoughts like a worm beneath fresh soil. And then he'd seen the mirror and the young man who'd stood in it. He'd seen that the young man he knew had been replaced by someone else, someone who looked like him but differed in just a few crucial details. He'd seen the eyes, the fangs and felt the dryness in his throat that still stung at him, even now. And right then and there, Issei had known. Not just known with a gut feeling. He'd been certain. The rational side of his mind had fought back against the notion, but it was a battle that had been lost before it started. So as he sat there, in that pale moonlight shining in through his bedroom window, his thoughts finally gained a form the world understood. They coalesced, pushed themselves together, and in 3 short words, finally made their mark. I'm a vampire. No weight dropped from Issei's shoulders as he spoke. Warmth didn't flood through him, he didn't let out a sigh of contentment. No disbelieving, instinctual shock tingled at his nerves. On some level, he supposed, his mind still didn't want to believe it. But as he repeated the 3 words to himself over and over again, Issei felt something else, perhaps something more valuable than a feeling of relief or relaxation. No more and no less than a sensation of slow acceptance of reality as it stood. That was, in itself, strange. He vaguely wondered if he should be frightened or scared or shocked in a way that he simply wasn't. After a while, Issei found himself standing up of his body's own will. His eyes watched as his legs carried him to the window, and the former stared through the glass. Issei couldn't quite say just what he was looking for, even as he stared out into the streets that had been shrouded beneath a dense fog. Perhaps a glimpse of someone else, for some sign that this and the previous day were all some multi-layered dream from which he'd yet to awaken. He held that position for several minutes, looking at the town beyond the glass, as one mystery shuffled out of his mind and was replaced with another. It wasn't the identity of the person who wrote the note. That he already had, or at least an alias. The writer, this Lady Morrigan, had been kind enough to sign her writings. The mystery was more fundamental in nature, yet more confounding by far. The note had been on the outside window, and yet Issei's bedroom was on the 2nd floor. Acceptance itself brought Issei no peace. He'd eventually crawled back under the covers, hoping to rest a little while longer, but the questions that the world had posed to him left him no chance to actually sleep away the 2 or so hours before he'd need to be up. And eventually, as the night sky vanished and the unwelcome sun began crawling in through his window, Issei gave up the effort. He rose a second time, once again pushed the blankets off of himself, and stood up from his bed. He supposed it was just a lost part of him, the humanity that ran his mind, that drew him over the window. But as he drew close, his eyes squinted and he let out a slight breath. The sunlight stung his bare skin, just as it had the previous day. But as he stood in the light, Issei came to a new realization. The pain wasn't as bad as it had been. It was still uncomfortable, but the sun's hatred seemed to have cooled into a more simple dislike. Issei frowned as he pulled down the window shade and wrapped his room in the gentleness of darkness. He wasn't surprised in the least to find that he could easily navigate his room, even without the aid of the sun or artificial lights. Nearly all legends of vampires, of course, placed them as being most at home in the night, but there was something else. A comfort, a warmth that Issei's human mind associated with the sun was there, in that darkness. But Issei knew he couldn't remain in his room until the sun went down as he would have preferred to. Regardless of what he was now, he still had a few distinctly human obligations. A couple of minutes later, Issei had changed into his school uniform. When he opened the door, Issei caught the distinct scent of his mother cooking breakfast, and a small smile creased his lips. He was very familiar with that smell, had become so long ago. And for the first time since he'd had it, Issei was happy for his radically improved sense of smell. But beneath that happiness, there was an unfamiliar frustration, a cry for something else. A scream from some part of him that didn't want his mother's cooking. It wasn't his conscious mind that complained. Or was that the wrong conflict? Was it something else, he wondered. Then he swallowed, and the parched feeling in his throat came back. And in an instant, Issei understood. His stomach wanted food, even as he stood there with the door open, he could feel it rumble and growl in his chest. But it wanted something else, too, and wanted that thing much more. Do not resist the craving, or it will drive you mad. Issei knew what craving the note spoke of, and he shuddered. Wonderful as the thought of indulging it was to a part of him, it was also true that Issei didn't know that part of his mind very well. Its instincts were new to his brain, and the human part of him wasn't exactly comfortable with its new roommate. The latter had no idea what the former might be planning, of how it might go about coexisting with it, or if it wanted to slit the throat of his humanity while it slept. But all his mental discomfort and all his moral queasiness at the idea didn't affect the slowly worsening dryness in his throat. It didn't lessen his thirst for blood. Issei grit his teeth and gave a fierce shake of his head even as the note's words crashed around inside his mind. The blood could wait. He wasn't crazy. Not yet, anyway. And as far as he was concerned, he could deal with the thirst for a while yet. The brunette took a long breath and let it out just as slowly before giving himself a quick nod. But even as he walked out of his room and towards the wonderful smells coming from the kitchen, there was still an unease that he did everything in his power to ignore. If nothing else, breakfast with his mother and father helped to ease Issei's anxiousness about that question just the slightest bit. His mother's anger seemed to have been cooled by the night's rest, and now she was just as chipper and happy as she usually was at the breakfast table. His father's behavior was nothing out of the ordinary, either. For his own part, Issei tried to focus on the smell of his father's shaving cream and the smell of his mother's perfume as the teen offered bits of conversation and discussion. It kept the smell of the blood parading through his parents' veins from taking center stage in his thoughts. The last thing he wanted was to be lulled into some sort of trance and bite at their necks or whatever. Issei had spent many hours coming up with plausible explanations for many things, but he knew that that particular instance was completely out of his reach. Breakfast was, overall, a relaxed and normal affair, and once it had concluded, Issei fetched his bags. A farewell to his parents later, Issei stepped into the morning light. The light wasn't gentle in the slightest, and for the first time that he could remember, Issei buttoned up his jacket. After all, the bits of him that stung were only those stretches of skin that lay exposed to the sun. Beneath the fabric, his skin was calm. Normal. More importantly, it didn't feel as though it were being stabbed with hundreds of needles all at once. His palms and skin were the only bits of skin left exposed. He could do little about either and resigned himself to bearing the discomfort as best he could. It was one of many irritations and aggravations, he supposed. Kuo smelled just as bad this morning as it had on his trek home the previous day. Not only that, it was much louder. He could only suppose that it was because it was Monday morning as opposed to Sunday. That wasn't to say that Issei reacted to the passage of cars to the same degree he had the previous day. Never did he quite get to the point of slamming his hands over his ears, though he came quite close when vehicles larger than normal cars rumbled by. At most, Issei reacted with a deep grimace, and that was as much from the stench of the exhaust as the scream of the engines. His pace was faster than the previous days, enough so that he arrived at the gates of Kuo Academy with just over 10 minutes before he needed to be in class. If he'd known quite what awaited him when he'd arrived, Issei wouldn't have rushed. If the inside of Issei's room smelled bad to his vampire's nose, the hallways of the school and the ground smelled like a septic tank. It wasn't as though the custodians and janitorial staff hadn't done their due diligence and cleaned up the school to a standard that no doubt vastly exceeded Issei's own room. No, the real problem was the students. But gently, a great number of them did not take the care to keep their clothes and bodies quite as clean as they could have. But slightly less gently, many of them could stand to use much more soap. That wasn't universally true, of course. There was no question in Issei's mind that at least some of them did their due diligence in hygiene. Those students, however, were outnumbered and the smell hung over the entire place like a choking fume. It was funny to Issei, if a thing with little humorous value can really be called funny. The previous week, he'd probably have been part of the problem that he also probably wouldn't have been aware existed. Yet on some level, the brunette was grateful for the reek just the same. After all, the noxious odor had the knock-on effect of blocking out a certain other scent, one he'd found it hard to ignore with just 2 people in the room. The noxious smell was annoying, but in more ways than one, it was better than smelling his classmates' blood. Homeroom passed without incident or anything of interest. The teacher might as well have been speaking ancient Latin for all that Issei was listening, all of his thoughts were pointed inwards. To the note in particular. The first 5 words were self-explanatory. He knew what the craving was, quite how he'd go about sating it was still up in the air, but he knew the what. No, what he found alarming was the second part. The more thought Issei put into it, the less sense it made. What did the writer mean by that? Would he grow crazed and deranged in stereotypical fashion, attacking everything that moved until his thirst was sated? Or simply retreat into his own head and never crawl back out? Issei gave a swallow at either thought and once more was reminded of his parched throat as the next class began a mathematics class. "Good morning, everyone," Ms. Kobayashi said in her usual tone, one which contained neither the warmth of the early morning nor any hint that she enjoyed seeing any of them in her field of view. Without waiting for any replies, she spoke her next instruction. "I'd like you all to take out the homework I assigned you over the weekend and pass it forwards." Right then and there, Issei's heart stopped. He wasn't the best student and he wouldn't claim to be, but he did take a little pride in his schoolwork. Not much in school made him feel stupid, quite like not having an assignment when it came time to hand things in. He remembered the assignment being given out, even remembered the exact number said he was required to do. But there was no recollection of him doing it. But still, in an effort to save a bit of face, hide the fact that he had nothing to pass up, Issei began digging through his binder, as though he weren't sure exactly where he'd left it in the rings. Then, after a few turned pages, a stapled pack of papers stared back at him. Issei blinked, not quite believing it. After a moment, he unclipped the homework assignment and skimmed it. "It's finished." Issei whispered in a voice so low that even he could barely hear himself. Yet despite his disbelief, it was indeed complete, every problem was answered, and work was shown for each and every one of them. After a moment or so, Issei felt something prod at his back. Something slightly sharp, yet with very little rigidity to back that attribute. He took the stack of papers from his classmate behind him without a word, added his own to the stack, and passed it forwards to repeat the process with the person in front of him. Issei made sure not to look the other student in the eye when he handed the papers off. Unbeknownst to Issei, at exactly that moment, a young-looking woman with bob-cut hair stood outside of his classroom door. Not directly outside, of course, she didn't want to disrupt the flow of any traffic coming in or out of the room. But very close by indeed. She stood there, wondering about the person she'd seen go in, about that vampire who hadn't been one when he'd left the campus the previous week. She knew that he hadn't been because he and his two cohorts had spent more than a couple of hours doing chores around the campus for their numerous rules violations. How they hadn't been expelled yet, she honestly wasn't sure. But his vampirism changed his course. No, the entire game. She'd seen a few of the disguised students this morning, seen their terrified reactions to a vampires wandering onto campus. And it would have been a lie to say that there wasn't just the smallest ounce of dread in her, too. Issei tried to pay attention to Ms. Kobayashi. He wanted to do well in his classes and not miss any parts and bits that would surely be important later. But the entire exercise was hopeless. He mindlessly copied the material being written on the whiteboard, but not for a minute could Issei stay focused on the woman trying to teach it. His thoughts were on other, more immediately relevant mysteries. Issei had reasoned out the mystery of the homework assignment inside of 30 seconds. He recalled Friday evening in solid detail, but had no recollection of doing this assignment. Ms. Kobayashi had assigned it to him that same day. He supposed it was a clue, but not one of much use. He'd done the homework assignment on Saturday, yes, but that was all he could glean from it. The clue lacked any useful context. Issei couldn't even say how long it would have taken him to do the assignment, and he didn't have any sort of set time to do homework even if he had. Issei didn't even consider asking his parents about the things he'd done on Saturday. That would have raised too many red flags, and he doubted that they'd be able to help him much, even if that weren't the case. His parents kept him on a bit of a loose leash, as they'd once put it, they didn't have the time, energy or interest to keep track of him everywhere he went and through everything he did. He had always appreciated that. After all, what teenager wants for their parents to hover over them and monitor their every move? Not to mention that their relaxed oversight would make it that much easier to get blood into his mouth. As he copied numbers and equations off the board, Issei wondered about the lack of emotion or disgust at the whole idea. In the media he'd consumed through the years, people who were turned into vampires always seemed to go through massive moral quandaries over consuming blood, seeming to reject it on a fundamental level. Issei felt none of that, there was only that odd feeling of acceptance, the same sensation as he'd felt a few hours before. Sure, there was something about the idea of drinking the blood of his former fellows that Issei found a tad nauseating, but that could be pushed aside. Issei found a lot of vegetables a tad nauseating, but he still pushed himself to eat those. He saw no point in denying the obvious or pretending that the thirst didn't exist. Not when every single drip of saliva that he swallowed was an uncomfortable reminder of his newfound craving. And certainly not when the price of refusing to indulge it was madness. But that acceptance just brought him face to face with the question of acquisition. He supposed he could play to the classical vampire image and begin prowling the streets at night. Stalking, waiting for the perfect victim and moment to strike. Then he'd pounce on some jogger or dog walker who'd made the mistake of letting themselves be alone in a safe town like Kuo after sundown. He'd hold his victims still as they screamed, fangs glinting in the night as they tore into the hapless human's neck. It was a sick little fantasy, and Issei knew there was no way in hell he was going to take that road. Putting aside that his conscious and moral mind was revolted by the very notion, Issei was sure that he'd never get away with even a single attack. And so his mind moved on. Even if, somewhere deep inside his head, that fantasy held an unacknowledged appeal. Luckily for Issei's wandering mind, Ms. Kobayashi never once called on him, and the class flowed by. He had no idea what the class had been about, and he could only hope that his notes would be sufficient for later study. The next class went exactly the same way. And then the next, and then the next. Every class was the same, keeping his mind on task remained an absolute impossibility. The wonder about where he could get blood without drawing any suspicion was a stressful thought that was simultaneously too intoxicating to ignore. His schoolmates weren't of any help to his focus, his nose grew used to the foul odors of their skin as the hours ticked by and the delectable salt and iron scent began to crawl back into his nostrils. Issei's nose loved that smell and hated it in equal measure. Loved it for how wonderful it was to his nose, hated it for how it teased and tormented his mind. It was a constant reminder, that smell, of the thirst, as though his own saliva wasn't enough. "It's all in here," that smell seemed to say, its tone mocking. "All this blood running through their veins. Oh, won't you take a bite, Issei? Tear through the flesh and take it." Even as the smell said that, it knew that Issei's own morals would stay any action. And thus was it free to continue torturing him, dangling the thing the vampire wanted so close, but hopelessly out of reach. Issei had hoped to shut his nose up for a little while at lunch. What he'd brought wasn't the healthiest, but it had a pungent aroma that he'd begun to hope would block the scent of blood all around him. No such luck. Sure, the scent of grease hazed the scent of blood. But the haze was thin. Easily pierced. And beneath the smell of his lunch, Issei could still make out the smell of blood. His stomach did nothing to improve that situation. It still growled and demanded to be sated with non-liquid sustenance, but it was less eager for that. Less eager, even, than it had been at breakfast this morning. What it really wanted was obvious, and it was equally obvious even as Issei ate that his stomach's patience in waiting was far less than his mind's. But that uncomfortable thought in his mind, Issei ate, barely tasting his food. The rest of the day slid by much in much the same way. Notes were copied, lectures were heard, no thought whatsoever was put into them. It almost came as a surprise to Issei to realize the classes had ended and that he was now free and rather strongly encouraged to leave the campus. Issei wasn't the type to be involved in after-school activities. At most, he occasionally helped out in cleaning the campus, and that was almost always done as a result of punishment for he and his cohort's activities. Most afternoons, he, Mitsuda and Motohama would leave the school almost as soon as they were allowed to. They'd congregate somewhere, most often Mitsuda's house, courtesy of his large personal television, and play video games and watch porn for hours on end. The day was a deviation from that routine, and not because Issei's mind was otherwise occupied. No, he could always make space in his head for naked girls. The real problem was, rather, that Mitsuda and Motohama were currently serving some punishment or another for peeping at the kendo club for the millionth time. That was, at least, the rumor, and having served many punishments for the same himself, Issei didn't question it in the slightest. Issei wasn't annoyed in the slightest at the fact that his friends had gotten in trouble. In fact, he was more angry that he wasn't right there, serving the punishment with them. The kendo club had been getting new uniforms that morning. Mitsuda had even mentioned that he'd found a new spot that offered a perfect view into the changing booths. And Issei, worried about his newly discovered vampirism, had forgotten. Of all the things to forget. A once-in-a-high-school experience moment, and he'd lost it to a small inconvenience. Even through Issei's hazy thoughts, there was a fuming anger and jealousy towards his friends. How much had they seen? Had the view been good? How many different girls had unknowingly stripped in front of them before they'd finally been discovered? And Mitsuda and Motohama would never let him live down missing it. He knew that much for sure. They'd ramble about this day and what they'd seen to him weeks, months, hell, probably years from now. Yet somewhere, beneath the frustration that filled him as he thought about missing the glory that world had witnessed that morning, there was something else. A tranquil yet frigid feeling. No, that was wrong. It wasn't so much a feeling as an inner voice, one that lectured him in a frosty tone. It sounded like his own voice, yet at the same time, it seemed to come from a completely different person. Are you fucking kidding me, Issei? You're worried about not seeing the kendo club naked for the 1000th time in your life. In case you hadn't noticed, you've got bigger problems to worry about. And the worst part. Even if he didn't want to admit it, the crystalline and icy voice seemed to have quite the point. Yet despite his two friends being indisposed, Issei did not simply go directly home after school. In fact, he didn't leave the campus at all. Instead, he headed straight for Kuo Academy's library. He had homework that needed doing, that much was true enough. But it would have been a lie to say that that was his primary motive for going there. Any decent school library, after all, contains information on far more than just what's immediately relevant to the students who attend the institution. And there was one bit of information that had been gnawing at him, looming in the background behind his immediate worries of sating his thirst before it consumed him. As soon as he entered the two-floor library, he made straight for one of the few open computers along the side wall. The smell of paper, amplified by his senses, was ignored as best it could be, and the vague smell of sweat that hung over the whole place went almost unnoticed. Instead, as Issei slid into a wooden chair, a single question was his focus. Issei had been looking through articles for nearly 20 minutes when he first felt the urge to scream. At 40 minutes, he had half a mind to put his fist through the computer screen. It wasn't an emotion born of fear, but of frustration. He'd hoped the name Morrigan would turn up some sort of family history, or if he was lucky, some sort of social media presence. Instead, it had turned up a number of curious articles, some were general information, others were clearly authored by altogether less professional writers. Half an hour's writing had established that the Morrigan was from Irish mythology. Beyond that, the only consistency that Issei could see was that there was no consistency. The Morrigan was a war goddess. Wait, no, one associated with sovereignty. Never mind, the Morrigan wasn't a goddess at all, but simply a figure of some kind. She encouraged warriors on the battlefield, except that she was apparently a figure associated heavily with portents of doom. Oh, but it was actually 3 figures with different names. Even the name Morrigan wasn't consistent. Issei counted at least 4 different renditions, each apparently having interacted with other names that Issei couldn't pronounce. Precisely nothing he found had anything to do with vampires. After nearly an hour had passed, Issei finally admitted the obvious to himself. The name on the note was another dead end. It was probably an alias, anyways, one no doubt picked so as to let anyone who tried to track it into exactly the sort of frustrating search of nothing that Issei was in right now. Issei nearly smashed his fist into the desk, thinking better of it moments before actually doing it. The brunette was unsure of the true limits of his newfound strength, and he didn't want to risk leaving a giant chunk of the wood missing. It would have been one of many things that Issei didn't have the ability to explain. So after 60 minutes or so, he cleared the browser windows and turned the monitor off. He cursed under his breath as he moved his bags to a nearby table, pulled out his homework, and began to write furiously. Even as he was leaving an hour and a half later, Issei had failed to take note of the petite white-haired student seated a few tables behind him. "What did you find out, Kaneko?" Kaneko Taoju swallowed, feeling slightly off-put by the 3 stares currently focused on her. She didn't hate the people behind them, of course, they all had reason to want to know what Kaneko had learned. That wouldn't make her like being the center of attention, though. Issei Hyoudou is a vampire. No question. Kaneko's red-haired master folded her own hands at that statement. The young woman's lip was sandwiched between slightly tense teeth. Her answer took a long time to come out, and when it did, it took the form of just a few words. "Oh, dear. Not good. How could that have happened?" A blond young man piped up. "You're sure he doesn't have some connection to the monstrous realms, President?" "You've asked me that twice now, Kiba," the red-haired woman said, slowly rubbing a temple. "The answer's still yes, at least as far as I've been able to find. I cross-referenced everything I could find on him with every supernatural database I have access to. Nothing came up at all." "But then how?" Kiba asked, the question more directed at himself than to his president. "The way most vampires get new converts, I'd guess," his master said. "Find someone they think would make a good addition to the species and work them over from there. Just going by what we have, I'd guess it'd probably have to be an extremely powerful example of the species," came the voice of the room's final inhabitant. "What makes you say that, Akeno?" Kiba asked. The violet-eyed, black-haired beauty shrugged. "It's simple, really. This vampire, whoever they are, managed to slip into Kuo and turn one of the students here, all without alerting a single one of us. Anything I might have missed, Riaz?" Her eyes drifted down to the red-haired woman seated on the couch that Akeno currently stood behind. Riaz exhaled. "Put that way, Akeno, it makes good sense. We might well have an elder on our hands." "What can we do about it?" Kiba asked, eyes narrowed. "Nothing at all," Riaz said. "You know how powerful elder vampires are. Any elder who deserved the title could kill all of us in a second." Kiba gritted his teeth, but said nothing. "That still doesn't explain why they came here," Akeno said. "There are dozens of cities and towns in this country that aren't being overseen by devils. Why come turn humans here?" "Thrill? Challenge?" Riaz said. "Honestly, I'm not sure that matters." Only then did Kaneko break in again, her words slightly hesitant. "I don't think that's right, President." Even as the words left Kaneko's mouth, a tiny shiver went through her, one hopefully imperceptible. Riaz raised her eyebrows slightly, though there was no malice or sarcasm in the gesture. "What do you mean, Kaneko?" Kaneko swallowed a second time. "When you sent me to check him out, I felt his aura. He wasn't hiding it." But there was something else for a moment. Kaneko stopped, searching for words. Riaz, Akeno and Kiba remained silent, eyes fixed on Kaneko once more. After a few seconds, Kaneko found her words once more. There was something beneath the aura. "Any idea what it was?" Riaz asked. Kaneko shook her head. "Couldn't tell. Not a clear enough aura to pick it out." "Even so, is there anything about it you could tell us?" The breath escaped the petite girl, then another breath and a third swallow. Then, Kaneko's eyes shifted to meet her master's. "All I could tell was that it was something powerful. Something angry." End of the here. So that's it for today's video guys. Before you go, just like the video and share it with your friends. Bye.